The world of the Mediterranean in the 3rd century before the Common Era was a restless place, caught between rising powers and fading empires. Among the most fascinating stories from that age is the tale of Hannibal Barca, a man whose name would echo through the centuries. His life became a story of relentless determination, driven by an oath made in childhood, an oath to oppose Rome until his dying breath. This script invites you to drift slowly into the past, to imagine warm sunlight falling across the harbors of Carthage. The scent of salt in the air, the bustle of merchants, the cries of sailors, and in the distance, a boy standing beside his father, pledging his life to a cause that seemed larger than himself. It is here in this quiet moment that Hannibal's story truly begins. A story that would one day lead him to the icy passes of the Alps, with elephants lumbering behind him, an army stretched thin, yet a spirit unbroken. Carthage itself was no ordinary city. It was a jewel of North Africa, founded centuries earlier by Phoenician settlers who carried with them the traditions of trade, navigation, and seafaring mastery. By Hannibal's time, it was a city of immense wealth, its harbors filled with ships, its markets alive with the voices of many tongues. Spices from the east, grain from Africa, silver from Spain, and goods from across the Mediterranean flowed into its warehouses. Yet beneath this prosperity lay tension. For Carthage had once challenged Rome for supremacy in the First Punic War, and lost. The loss had cut deep, both in pride and in power. For Sicily, once Carthaginian, was now Roman. The humiliation lingered like a wound that refused to heal. And among those who felt it most strongly was the family of Hannibal Barca. The Barca family were no ordinary citizens. They were warriors, commanders, and visionaries. Men who believed in Carthage's destiny as a power not just of trade but of arms. Hannibal's father, Hannibal Barca, had fought the Romans and knew both their strengths and their weaknesses. He nurtured in his children a bitterness against Rome that went beyond rivalry, teaching them that Rome would never rest until Carthage was destroyed. We said that when Hannibal was only 9 years old, his father took him by the hand to the altar, where sacred offerings burned, and made him swear eternal hatred of Rome. This was no casual oath, no childish play. It was a binding promise, sealed with the gravity of faith and destiny, one that would shape the course of Hannibal's entire life. Years passed, and Hannibal grew into a soldier of rare skill and imagination. He inherited not only his father's enmity toward Rome, but also his daring spirit. Where others saw limits, Hannibal saw possibilities. Where others planned with caution, Hannibal dreamed of bold maneuvers. His mind was restless, always turning over strategies, always seeking a way to strike Rome where it would least expect it. This restlessness would eventually give rise to one of the most astonishing feats in military history, the march across the Alps. But before that decision was made, the world had to drift toward war once more, and Carthage needed to find its footing in the shifting sands of power. Spain became the foundation of Carthage's recovery. While Rome tightened its grip over Sicily and the western Mediterranean, Carthage turned its eyes to the Iberian Peninsula. Rich in silver mines, fertile land, and hardy warriors, Spain offered both wealth and manpower. Barca led the way, carving out territory, forging alliances with local tribes, and laying the groundwork for Carthaginian strength. When he died, his son-in-law Hasdrubal the Fair continued this work, building cities and expanding Carthaginian influence. And when Hasdrubal was assassinated, the mantle of command fell upon Hannibal, still young, but already fierce in spirit. The army in Spain, loyal to the Barca name, accepted him as their leader. And thus Hannibal stepped fully into his role as Carthage's greatest hope. In Spain, Hannibal honed his craft. He learned the land, the tribes, and the art of commanding men from different cultures and tongues. His army was a mosaic. Iberians with their curved swords, Africans with their discipline and spears, Numidian cavalry swift and elusive, and even war elephants, massive beasts that carried terror into enemy ranks. He led them with charisma, not through cruelty, but through respect, inspiring them to follow him not merely because of command, but because of trust. It was in this environment that Hannibal's genius began to shine, not as a shadow of his father, but as a light of his own. Rome, however, watched closely. The expansion of Carthaginian influence in Spain was not taken lightly. Treaties had been made after the First Punic War, and Rome believed Carthage was violating them. When Hannibal laid siege to the city of Saguntum, a Roman ally in Spain, the stage was set. Rome demanded his surrender, but Carthage refused. War became inevitable. The Second Punic War had begun, and both sides braced for a struggle that would determine the fate of the Mediterranean. Yet Hannibal, unlike his predecessors, had no intention of meeting Rome on predictable ground. He was not content to defend Spain, nor to fight in Africa. His mind reached further, to a plan as daring as it was unthinkable. He would carry the war into Italy itself. This decision was not born of recklessness, but of careful thought. Hannibal knew Rome's strength lay in its alliances, in its ability to summon legions from across Italy. To defeat Rome, he had to break those alliances, to show Rome's subjects that the Republic could not protect them. To do this, he needed to strike at Rome's heartland, to appear suddenly on Italian soil in a way so shocking that it would shake the very foundations of Roman confidence. The sea was blocked by Roman fleets. The land route through southern Gaul was long and dangerous, but possible. And beyond Gaul rose the towering Alps, a wall of stone and snow that seemed impassable to armies. Yet it was here that Hannibal fixed his gaze, for what seemed impossible to others appeared to him as the perfect way to achieve surprise. The Alps were no ordinary mountains. They rose jagged and immense, crowned with ice, swept by bitter winds, carved by rivers and cliffs. Few armies had ever attempted to cross them, and none on the scale Hannibal envisioned. But in this danger lay opportunity. Rome would not expect him to appear through those frozen passes. Rome would not prepare for an invasion from that direction. If he succeeded, he could descend into Italy like a storm breaking over unsuspecting fields, with elephants at his side and an army hardened by struggle. It was a gamble, perhaps even madness, but it was the kind of gamble that could change history. Imagine, then, the camps of Hannibal's army in Spain as this plan took shape. Fires burned in the night, soldiers murmured in many tongues, and elephants swayed in the glow of torchlight. Around Hannibal, his officers debated. Some doubted, pointing to the snow, the cliffs, the hostile tribes who guarded the mountain paths. Others trusted, remembering Hannibal's victories, his uncanny instinct for finding a way where none seemed to exist. Hannibal listened, weighed their words, and returned again to his vision. He knew the cost would be terrible, but he also knew that hesitation would cost even more. Rome was relentless, and only boldness could match it. When he finally made his decision, it carried the weight of destiny. He would march his army across the Pyrenees, through Gaul, and into the Alps. He would endure what needed to be endured, sacrifice what needed to be sacrificed, and emerge in Italy, ready to break Rome's power. It was a plan that would demand not just strategy but endurance, not just courage but faith. His men would suffer hunger, cold, and fear, yet Hannibal believed that their suffering would forge them into something stronger, something capable of overturning Rome's might. And so, with the sound of horns echoing across the valleys, the march began, step by step, toward the mountains that seemed to touch the sky. At this point, the story becomes more than history, becomes legend. The very thought of an army dragging elephants through narrow mountain passes seems like something from myth. Yet it happened, and it remains one of the most astonishing feats of the ancient world. Hannibal's march over the Alps is remembered not only because it succeeded, but because it symbolized the audacity of human will against the harshness of nature. As we drift deeper into this tale, picture yourself among those soldiers, breathing cold air, watching the peaks loom higher, feeling the uncertainty of what lay ahead. It is a journey both terrifying and inspiring, one that reminds us how far determination can carry the human spirit. In this beginning, then, we have the elements of the great drama. A city wounded by defeat, family bound by oath, a leader unafraid of the impossible, and an enemy that seemed unstoppable. These threads intertwined to create the fabric of Hannibal's march. The fires of Carthage burned in his memory, the faces of his men stood before him, and the towering Alps lay ahead. The march was not yet upon him, but the decision had been made. And history itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what this young commander would dare to do. And so, Part 1 closes with anticipation. The armies are gathering, the oaths have been sworn, the plans have been laid. Ahead lies the long road through Gaul, the treacherous rivers, the hostile tribes, at last the snow and ice of the Alps. Hannibal has chosen his path, and nothing now will turn him back. Like a river carving through stone, his will pushes forward, shaping events that will echo for centuries. The march is about to begin. The decision to leave Spain behind was not one made lightly. Hannibal understood that by stepping away from the Iberian Peninsula, he risked losing ground to Rome's counterattacks there, yet his greater aim required such a sacrifice. The Iberian tribes had been crucial to Carthage's growing power, and many of them had pledged loyalty to Hannibal himself rather than to distant Carthage. When he announced his plan to march east, some wavered, and others resisted outright. Rebellion sparked in the rear, forcing Hannibal to leave a portion of his forces behind to maintain control. Even so, he pressed forward, understanding that not all would follow him, and not all needed to. What mattered most was the core of his army, the men he trusted to endure the unimaginable. Crossing the Pyrenees was the first true test. The mountains were not as formidable as the Alps, yet they still loomed tall, their ridges sharp, their valleys deep, and their paths uncertain. Hannibal's men struggled with narrow trails, sudden storms, and the hostility of local tribes who resented any foreign army passing through their territory. Supplies had to be carried carefully, and the elephants, unused to such terrain, moved slowly their size, both an advantage in strength and a hindrance in agility. Still, Hannibal pressed on. The Pyrenees became a proving ground, a place where the army learned what it meant to move as one body through lands that were not welcoming. It was here that doubt began to gnaw at some of the soldiers, though Hannibal's presence, calm and resolute, steadied them. Beyond the mountains lay Gaul, a land both vast and unpredictable. The Gallic tribes were fierce and independent, their loyalties shifting with circumstance, their warriors proud and eager for battle. Rome had long tried to influence these tribes, and Hannibal knew he must tread carefully if he wished to pass without being swallowed by endless skirmishes. Through gifts, negotiations, and displays of strength, he carved a path forward. Some tribes joined him, eager to strike at Rome, while others resisted, testing his resolve in ambushes and sudden raids. The army had to fight its way through more than once, but Hannibal used each challenge as a lesson, teaching his men discipline in the face of chaos, reminding them that every step forward was a step closer to their great purpose. The rivers of Gaul were another obstacle. Broad and swift, they cut across the land like barriers of liquid steel. Among these rivers, none posed a greater challenge than the Rhine. Wide, cold, and fast-moving, it seemed to dare Hannibal to attempt a crossing. On the far bank, Roman allies gathered, determined to block his path. For a time, it seemed as though the campaign might end before it truly began, trapped at the edge of this relentless current. But Hannibal was no stranger to improvisation. He ordered rafts to be built, ropes to be strung, and elephants to be coaxed into the water. The sight of those massive animals swimming across, their trunks lifted like natural snorkels, left an impression that has never faded from history. One by one, the army crossed, enduring the cold bite of the river. And when they reached the far shore, they drove back those who dared to oppose them. This crossing was not just a physical feat, but a psychological one. It proved to his men that nothing was beyond their reach. It's not mountains, not rivers, not even the armies Rome sent to oppose them. Each success built upon the last, weaving a sense of invincibility that Hannibal nurtured carefully. He reminded them of their oath, of their mission, of the greatness that awaited them when they struck Rome in its own homeland. By now, the march was no longer simply a military maneuver. It was becoming a legend in the making, and Hannibal was its central figure, a commander who seemed destined to defy the impossible. In Gaul, Hannibal's charisma played as much a role as his strategy. He met with chieftains, sat by their fires, and listened to their grievances against Rome. Many tribes had suffered under Roman expansion, and to them, Hannibal appeared as a savior, a foreigner who promised liberation rather than domination. He cultivated these alliances carefully, always mindful of the delicate balance of trust. Where persuasion failed, force was used, but Hannibal preferred persuasion, for he understood that willing allies would fight more fiercely than reluctant subjects. By weaving together this patchwork of loyalties, he transformed his march from a lonely gamble into a movement that carried with it the hopes of many. Yet even as support grew, so too did resistance. Not all Gauls welcomed him. Some feared Roman retaliation more than they trusted Carthaginian promises, and others simply saw an opportunity to raid and harass a passing army. Skirmishes broke out in forests and valleys, arrows flew from hidden positions, and ambushes tested the endurance of Hannibal's men. Food grew scarce at times, and the long march began to wear on the soldiers' bodies. Still, Hannibal's determination remained unshaken. He set the example, enduring hunger when his men did, sharing in their hardships, and refusing the luxuries a commander might otherwise demand. His presence reminded them that their suffering was shared, and that unity was their only path forward. As the march continued, word reached Hannibal that a Roman army had been dispatched under Publius Cornelius Scipio to intercept him. Rome, alarmed by his bold advance, was determined to block his entry into Italy. Yet fortune tilted in Hannibal's favor. Scipio arrived too late to confront him at the reign, and by the time the Romans realized the direction Hannibal had taken, it was already pressing deeper into Gaul. The race between the two commanders was a tense one, each maneuver shaping the course of the war to come. For Hannibal, slipping past Scipio was a victory in itself, a demonstration that Rome's famed legions could be outmaneuvered even before battle was joined. The further east Hannibal traveled, the closer he drew to the looming silhouette of the Alps. His men began to hear tales from local tribes about the mountains. Stories of endless snow, treacherous paths, and hostile people who defended the passes with ferocity. The very thought of crossing such terrain filled many with dread, and murmurs of fear spread through the ranks. Hannibal listened to these concerns, not dismissing them, but turning them into fuel for his vision. He reminded his men that Rome expected them to falter, that the Alps were Rome's shield, and that by conquering them, they would strike fear into the very heart of their enemy. The elephants became a symbol of hope and terror alike during this time. To his soldiers, they were a reminder of Carthaginian strength, towering beasts that no Roman army had ever faced in their own land. To the Gauls, they seemed almost mythical, creatures from another world. Their bulk shaking the earth as they walked, their trumpeting carrying across the valleys. Managing them was no small task, for they required vast amounts of food and constant care, but Hannibal refused to abandon them. He understood their value not just in battle but in spirit, for they embodied the boldness of his plan. If elephants could march across mountains, then surely men could as well. Step by step, the army drew nearer to the mountains that waited like silent giants. Supplies were gathered where possible, though never in abundance, and scouts were sent ahead to learn what they could of the terrain. The paths were uncertain, the dangers many, but the vision remained clear. Hannibal's speeches during these nights were remembered long after, calm, steady, reassuring. He spoke of destiny, of the eyes of Carthage watching them, of the chance to make history. He spoke of Rome's pride and how sweet it would be to humble it. Each word settled into the minds of his soldiers like a spark, keeping their courage alive even as the unknown closed in around them. In the quiet moments, when fires burned low and soldiers drifted to sleep, Hannibal himself would stand watch, gazing toward the distant peaks. Perhaps he wondered then at the enormity of what he planned to do, at the countless lives depending on his judgment, at the risk of failure. But if doubt touched him, it never showed. To his men he was unwavering, a commander who walked with certainty even when the path was hidden. And it was this certainty that carried them forward through the last stretches of Gaul, toward the mountains that seemed to scrape the heavens. The rain was behind them, the Gauls had been faced, and Rome's first attempt to halt the march had failed. What lay ahead would test them in ways no battle had yet done. The Alps awaited, their peaks crowned with snow, their valleys filled with peril. It was there that Hannibal would either be broken or immortalized. As the army approached those towering barriers, the march transformed once more. No longer a campaign across familiar lands, but a journey into the unknown, into a place where nature itself seemed an enemy. And still, Hannibal pressed on, eyes fixed not on the mountains before him, but on the plains of Italy that lay beyond. The summit had been reached, and with it came a fleeting moment of triumph. From the high ridges, Italy spread before Hannibal's army like a promised land, a hazy expanse of green valleys and rolling plains far below. For a brief instant, the soldiers felt hope flood through them. The Alps had not broken them, though the mountains had taken their toll. They had endured storms, avalanches, ambushes, and hunger. Yet here they stood, having achieved what many had called impossible. Hannibal gathered them on that icy peak, reminding them that Rome's soil lay within sight, that their suffering had not been in vain. But even as he spoke of destiny, the men knew that the journey was not yet complete. For what lay ahead was perhaps even more dangerous than the climb, the descent into Italy. Descending a mountain can often be more treacherous than ascending it, and for Hannibal's army, this truth revealed itself quickly. The narrow paths carved by centuries of snowmelt and shifting stone sloped steeply downward. Ice clung stubbornly to the rock, turning every step into a gamble. Horses slipped and fell, dragging their riders with them. Pack animals, loaded with what little supplies remained, stumbled and toppled into the ravines below. Even the elephants, so carefully guided on the climb, struggled to keep their footing on the steep and crumbling trails. Each loss of life and supply cut deep, for the army had little left to spare. The weather, too, turned against them. Snow fell thick and heavy, blinding their eyes, muffling their steps, and obscuring the path. The cold pierced through their thin clothing, numbing fingers and stiffening limbs. Men huddled together at night, pressing close to their fires, though wood was scarce, and flames sputtered weakly in the thin air. Frostbite claimed some, exhaustion claimed others, and despair threatened to do the rest. Hannibal, ever watchful, moved among his soldiers, sharing their burdens, lifting their spirits with calm words and steady presence. He knew that if their resolve broke here, the entire campaign would collapse before it began. At one point, the army reached a pass so treacherous that progress seemed impossible. A landslide had swept away the path, leaving only a sheer slope of broken rock and ice where once a narrow trail had wound along the mountainside. To turn back was unthinkable, yet to move forward seemed madness. Hannibal, however, refused to yield. He ordered fires built along the slope, heating the rock until it cracked. His men hammered and carved at the weakened stone, clearing a path where none existed. It was back-breaking work, carried out in bitter cold and constant danger, but slowly the way was opened. Elephants were coaxed forward on makeshift platforms of earth and timber, their great feet steadying the unstable ground. Inch by inch, the army passed through, proving once again that determination could bend even the harshest terrain. As they moved lower, the snow began to thin, and patches of earth appeared. For the first time in weeks, the soldiers smelled soil rather than ice, grass rather than frost. It was a relief that lifted their hearts, though danger still lurked. Tribes of the lower Alps, emboldened by the weakened state of the army, harassed their descent. Arrows flew from the ridges, stones tumbled from above, and sudden attacks struck at stragglers. Hannibal responded with swift discipline, rallying his men to repel each assault. The Numidian cavalry, though weary, proved invaluable, darting up the slopes to scatter ambushers before they could regroup. Every skirmish drained the army further, yet every survival reinforced their belief that nothing could stop them now. Food remained a pressing problem. Stores they had carried into the mountains were nearly gone, and the land offered little beyond scattered shrubs and the occasional herd of wild goats. Men boiled leather straps for broth, chewed roots for sustenance, and prayed for the abundance of the valleys below. The elephants suffered most, their massive bodies requiring far more than could be provided. Many grew thin, their steps slow, their eyes dulled by hunger. Hannibal knew that not all would survive, but he refused to abandon them. Each elephant that pressed onward was a symbol, a reminder of the army's spirit, and he clung to that symbol as fiercely as he clung to his vision. At last, after days of grueling descent, the army began to emerge from the high passes. The air grew warmer, the snow receded, and streams of fresh water trickled from the rocks. Trees appeared once more, their branches a welcome sight after the barren peaks. The soldiers, gaunt and weary, felt life return to their limbs. They drank deeply, gathered what food they could, and felt, for the first time in weeks, that the worst might be behind them. They had not been broken, though they had been bent nearly to the point of breaking. And as they set foot on the soil of Italy, they knew that their suffering had given them strength. A hardness that Rome itself would soon feel. Hannibal, standing at the head of his army, allowed himself a moment of reflection. He looked back at the towering peaks they had crossed, their jagged crowns piercing the clouds. Few would ever believe that such an army had passed through them. Fewer still would understand the cost. Yet here he stood, with men still willing to follow, elephants still standing beside him, and the plains of Italy stretching ahead. His gamble had succeeded. He had achieved the impossible, and now Rome would face the consequences. The march across the Alps would be remembered not merely as a feat of endurance, but as the boldest stroke of strategy in the ancient world. But survival was not victory, and Hannibal knew it. His army had been reduced, his supplies depleted, and the battles ahead would demand everything they had left. Rome would not sit idle while a Carthaginian force roamed its homeland. Already, news of his crossing spread, stirring fear and disbelief. Roman commanders moved to intercept, alliances were tested, and the stage was set for confrontation. Hannibal's men had conquered nature itself, but now they would have to conquer legions. The Alps had been the first great trial, yet the true war was only just beginning. The soldiers, though weary, felt a surge of pride. They had done what no one believed possible, and in doing so, they had become something more than ordinary men. They had marched where even gods might hesitate, and they had survived. Around the campfires at night, they spoke of their journey, of the snow, the storms, the ambushes, and the elephants that had carried on beside them. Their voices carried not despair but wonder, for they knew they were part of a story greater than themselves, a story that would echo long after they were gone. This knowledge steadied them, binding them together with a sense of destiny. The elephants, though fewer in number, remained an awe-inspiring sight. As they emerged into the valleys of Italy, farmers and villagers looked on in disbelief at the towering beasts. To the Romans, who had never faced such creatures in their own land, the psychological shock would be immense. Hannibal understood this, and he ensured that the elephants marched at the forefront when possible, symbols of his defiance and his power. They were living banners of the Carthaginian presence, declarations that no barrier, natural or man-made, could halt their advance. For Hannibal himself, the descent marked both an ending and a beginning. He had carried his men through the crucible of the Alps, and in doing so, he had transformed them. They were no longer merely an army, or survivors, bound by shared struggle, hardened by suffering, and fueled by purpose. Yet he also knew that every step forward would now be contested, that every valley and plain of Italy would become a battleground. The Alps had given them passage, but Rome would not give them peace. Ahead lay years of war, of battles that would test not only their endurance, but their cunning, their courage, and their unity. The mountains rose like a wall before Hannibal's army, their peaks shrouded in mist, their ridges sharp against the sky. For many of his soldiers, the sight was terrifying, a reminder that they were about to attempt something that few had ever dared. The Alps were no mere hills to be climbed with effort and patience. They were immense, jagged fortresses of nature, home to storms, avalanches, and tribes that guarded the passes with hostility. Yet Hannibal looked upon them not with fear, but with determination. To him, the Alps were not a barrier, but a gateway, the key to surprising Rome in its own heartland. As the soldiers murmured their doubts, Hannibal reminded them that each step forward carried them closer to glory, and that what seemed impossible today would be remembered for centuries tomorrow. The first days in the Alps were a mixture of wonder and dread. The air grew thinner as the army climbed, and with it came a biting cold that seeped through cloth and armor alike. Below them, rivers foamed far out of reach, their roars echoing through the mountains. Above them, eagles circled, as if watching with interest this strange procession of men, horses, and elephants daring to enter a world meant for gods and storms. The soldiers trudged on, their breaths visible in the chill, their bodies burdened by packs and weapons, their eyes fixed on the uncertain path ahead. The elephants struggled most of all, for the narrow paths were not made for creatures of such size. Hannibal ordered the engineers to cut away rock, to build makeshift ramps and supports, anything to ease the passage of these living symbols of Carthaginian might. At times the animals balked, their deep rumbling cries echoing off the cliffs, unnerving the soldiers who followed behind. Yet their presence lifted morale as well. To see those great beasts pressing forward was to believe that the impossible might indeed be overcome. They were more than animals. They were emblems of Hannibal's audacity, reminders that this march was unlike anything the world had seen. But the mountains were not uninhabited. The Alpine tribes, fierce and wary, watched the Carthaginians from above, their eyes sharp and calculating. They knew the land, its paths, its hiding places, and they saw in this foreign army both a threat and an opportunity. At first, they approached with offers of peace, speaking of safe passage, offering guides to lead the way. Hannibal, cautious yet hopeful, accepted these gestures, for he knew alliances could be as valuable as victories. For a time, the tribes walked alongside his army, pointing out the routes, sharing food, speaking of what lay ahead. Yet beneath this surface of friendship lay a darker intent, for the mountains bred mistrust, and betrayal was never far away. The ambush came suddenly, as the army wound its way through a narrow pass. From above, rocks crashed down, sending men and animals tumbling into the depths. Arrows and spears rained from hidden positions. The Carthaginians scrambled to defend themselves on terrain that offered little cover. Panic spread, for the cliffs left no room to maneuver, and the soldiers felt the crushing weight of both enemy and mountain pressing against them. Hannibal, calm, even amid the chaos, rallied his men, directing counterattacks, urging them to hold their ground. Slowly, with discipline and determination, the army fought back, driving the tribes away, though not without loss. The cost was heavy, and the lesson clear. The mountains themselves were hostile, and every step would be contested. The days that followed were filled with hardship. Food grew scarce, for the land offered little beyond scrub and thin grass. The soldiers rationed what they carried, while the elephants consumed vast amounts, forcing constant searches for fodder. Cold winds tore through the passes, chilling men to the bone, while sudden storms turned paths into slick, treacherous slopes. At night, the soldiers huddled close to their fires, wrapping themselves in cloaks, listening to the wind howl through the peaks. Some whispered of turning back, of abandoning the mad dream of crossing the Alps, but Hannibal would hear none of it. He spoke to his officers, reminding them of their oath, of their mission, of the victory that awaited beyond the mountains. His words carried through the camp, steadying the wavering, rekindling the resolve of those who had begun to despair. Despite the hardships, moments of beauty appeared, fleeting yet powerful. At dawn, the peaks glowed gold with the rising sun, their icy crowns glittering like jewels. Streams of meltwater tumbled down cliffs, their music mingling with the calls of distant birds. Even the soldiers, weary and cold, could not help but pause at times, struck by the majesty of the land they crossed. To them it seemed as though they walked not upon the earth, but upon the very spine of the world, closer to the heavens than they had ever been. These moments gave them strength, reminding them that their struggle was part of something vast, something worthy of remembrance. The elephants, too, adapted slowly. Though the paths tested their footing, the beasts learned to move with caution, their keepers guiding them carefully. In places where the cliffs narrowed dangerously, Hannibal ordered platforms of earth and timber to be built. Labor that exhausted the men but saved the animals. Each success was celebrated, for the survival of the elephants became a symbol of the army's endurance. Soldiers who had cursed their presence now looked to them with pride, seeing in their steady progress a reflection of their own determination. If such great creatures could climb mountains, then surely men could as well. Further into the Alps, the army encountered more treachery. Another tribe, feigning alliance, invited Hannibal's men into their fortified village, only to turn on them when the chance arose. Fighting erupted in cramped spaces, the air filled with smoke and cries, the clash of steel echoing against the wooden walls. Hannibal, always quick to adapt, ordered a swift counterattack, and the Carthaginians broke free, setting the village ablaze as they pressed onward. Yet each betrayal chipped away at morale, teaching the soldiers that no promise could be trusted, and that the mountains themselves seemed to breed deception. The higher they climbed, the harsher the conditions became. Snow began to appear, first as patches along the path, then as blankets covering the ridges. The cold deepened, numbing fingers and stiffening limbs. Horses slipped and fell, their riders scrambling to safety, while supply animals stumbled under their burdens. More than once, men vanished into the whiteness, swallowed by avalanches or slipping into unseen crevices. The losses mounted, and with them came fear, for it seemed the mountains demanded a toll in blood for every step forward. Yet Hannibal urged them on, reminding them that each hardship brought them closer to Italy, to Rome, to the prize that justified their suffering. There were moments when despair threatened to overwhelm the army. The sight of endless snowfields, stretching into the horizon, sapped their strength. The howling wind seemed to mock their efforts, and the silence of the peaks pressed down upon them like a weight. In those moments, Hannibal gathered his men, standing before them with the calm authority that had carried them so far. He pointed to the distant plains that could be glimpsed in the valleys below, telling them that Italy lay just beyond, that victory was within their reach. His words carried a quiet power, not the bluster of false hope, but the steady reassurance of a man who believed with all his heart. At last, after days of hardship, they reached a high summit. From there, the land of Italy stretched out before them, faint and hazy in the distance, yet undeniably real. The soldiers, exhausted, paused to take in the sight, their spirits lifted by the proof that their suffering had not been in vain. Hannibal seized the moment, gathering them together, speaking of destiny, of the greatness that awaited them. He reminded them that the worst was behind, that Rome itself lay vulnerable before them. In that moment, the army felt a surge of hope, enough to carry them forward into the descent that awaited. Yet the descent would prove no easier than the climb. The paths downward were steeper, narrower, more treacherous, with snow and ice making every step perilous. Men and animals alike slipped, sliding down slopes, tumbling into ravines. Supplies were lost, lives were lost, and the hardships mounted. But the sight of Italy sustained them, and Hannibal's steady presence kept them moving. The Alps had tested them, broken many, but those who remained were hardened, their spirits forged in suffering. They had crossed into a new world, one where every step would echo in history. The Carthaginian army, weary yet unbroken, had finally descended from the high ridges of the Alps into the fertile valleys of northern Italy. For the soldiers, it was a moment of both relief and disbelief. They had endured storms, starvation, and betrayal among the peaks, and now the soft earth of the plains cushioned their steps. Fields of grain stretched before them, rivers wound lazily through the land, and villages dotted the countryside. Two men who had survived on scraps of leather and bitter roots, it felt like abundance. Yet they also knew that they had stepped into enemy territory. Every farmhouse, every village, every road belonged to Rome, and the legions would soon come marching to meet them. Hannibal wasted no time. The march had been about getting here, and now that he was here, the war against Rome truly began. News of Hannibal's arrival spread quickly, and with it came fear. For the Romans, the Alps were thought to be an impenetrable barrier. They had expected Hannibal to remain bottled up in Spain, or at best, struggle in Gaul. To hear that he had crossed into Italy itself, with elephants and an army intact, shook their confidence. Rome prided itself on order, on control, on predictability. Hannibal had overturned all of that in a single gamble. Publius Cornelius Scipio, the Roman consul who had tried to intercept Hannibal at the Rhine, now scrambled to catch up, hurrying north to confront this unexpected threat. The two armies soon found themselves eyeing each other across the plain near the Ticinus River. The Ticinus was not a great battle by scale, but it was the first clash between Rome and Hannibal on Italian soil. It began as a skirmish of cavalry, with Hannibal's Numidian horsemen darting across the fields, their movements swift and unpredictable. The Romans, unused to facing such tactics, struggled to adapt. The Numidians feigned retreat, then wheeled suddenly, striking from behind. Hannibal's cavalry pressed hard, surrounding the Roman horse and driving them into confusion. In the chaos, the young Publius Cornelius Scipio, son of the consul, fought desperately and was nearly killed, saved only by the bravery of his soldiers. This young man, who would one day be known as Scipio Africanus, barely escaped with his life. The Romans were forced to retreat, their confidence shaken by Hannibal's first strike. Though the skirmish at the Ticinus was small, its impact was immense. Hannibal had shown that his army, though battered by the Alps, was still a force to be reckoned with. He had also revealed the power of his cavalry, particularly the Numidians, whose speed and maneuverability gave him a weapon that Rome had no equal for. To his soldiers, the victory was a sign that their suffering had been worthwhile, that destiny truly favored them. To the Romans, it was a warning that this invader was not to be underestimated. The clash set the stage for a larger confrontation, one that would come soon at the Trebia River. As the armies maneuvered, Hannibal sought to draw Rome into battle on his own terms. He understood that his strength lay not in numbers but in cunning. His army was smaller than what Rome could eventually muster, but it was more diverse, more flexible, and after the Alps, more hardened. He also had the advantage of surprise. Rome had not expected to fight here, and its legions were unprepared for an enemy that had already shown himself willing to defy every expectation. Hannibal scouted the land carefully, seeking a place where terrain and strategy could tilt the balance in his favor. His choice would be the Trebia River, a place where cold water and clever traps could break the pride of Rome. The Trebia in winter was a bitter thing, its waters icy, its banks muddy and treacherous. Hannibal understood that, to force the Romans to cross it before battle would sap their strength and dull their spirit. He also concealed a portion of his army in ambush, hidden in the reeds and hollows near the battlefield. The trap was set, and all that remained was to lure the Romans into it. When the day of battle came, Hannibal sent his Numidian cavalry to harass the Roman camp, drawing them out with feigned attacks. The Roman consul, Sempronius Longus, eager for glory, ordered his legions forward without proper preparation. The men crossed the freezing river at dawn, their bodies soaked and chilled, their strength already diminished before they even reached the battlefield. What awaited them was a storm of Carthaginian steel. Hannibal's infantry pressed forward, Iberians and Africans locking shields, while his cavalry swung around to strike at the Roman flanks. The elephants, though fewer now, charged into the fray, their size and power terrifying the Roman soldiers who had never faced such beasts before. And then, at the critical moment, Hannibal's hidden force burst from its cover, slamming into the rear of the Roman formation. Trapped between river, infantry, cavalry, and elephants, the Roman army fell into confusion. Discipline broke, formations collapsed, and what had begun as a proud advance turned into a desperate struggle for survival. The battle raged fiercely, but the outcome was never truly in doubt. Rome's legions, caught off guard and worn down by cold and exhaustion, could not withstand the coordinated fury of Hannibal's army. By the end of the day, thousands lay dead, and the survivors retreated in disarray. Hannibal had won his first great victory on Italian soil, a triumph that sent shockwaves through the Republic. The myth of Roman invincibility had been pierced, and the man who had dared to cross the Alps had proven himself not only bold but deadly. For Hannibal's men, the victory at the Trebia was a moment of vindication. They had suffered terribly in the mountains, and now they saw the reward for their endurance. Around their fires at night, they spoke with pride of how the Romans had been lured. Trapped and broken, their voices carrying a new confidence. The elephants, though still few, had done their part, their presence as much psychological as physical. The Numidian cavalry, darting and striking with unmatched skill, had shown once again that Hannibal's army was unlike any Rome had faced. Each soldier felt that he was part of something greater than himself, a story that would be told long after their bones had turned to dust. For the Romans, the defeat was sobering. They had expected to sweep aside this foreign invader, weakened as he was from the Alps. Instead, it had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and outfought. Yet Rome was not a city that broke easily. Defeat to them was not an end, but a challenge. The Senate resolved to raise more armies, to call upon more allies, to redouble their efforts. Hannibal had struck hard, but Rome's strength lay not only in its legions, but in its resilience. The war was far from over, and both sides knew that greater battles lay ahead. Hannibal, reflecting on the victory, did not allow arrogance to cloud his judgment. He understood that each success brought him closer to Rome, but also deeper into enemy territory. He could not replace his losses as easily as Rome could. Every battle had to be chosen carefully. Every victory had to be decisive. Yet he also knew that momentum was on his side. The march across the Alps had seemed madness, but now it looked like genius. Rome's allies began to waver, whispering among themselves that perhaps Hannibal was the future, and Rome the fading past. It was this uncertainty, as much as any battle, that Hannibal sought to cultivate. As winter settled over Italy, Hannibal's army found shelter, recovering from the march and the battles. They rested, gathered supplies, and prepared for the campaigns ahead. The men spoke of home, of Carthage, of Spain, yet they also felt that they had found a new home here, in the shadow of Rome. The land was rich, the people divided, and the possibilities endless. Hannibal encouraged this spirit, reminding them that they were not merely invaders, but liberators, striking at a power that had crushed so many under its rule. He cast himself not as a conqueror, but as an ally to those who resented Rome. And in this role, he sought to unravel the very fabric of the Republic. After the victories at the Ticinus and the Trebia, Hannibal held northern Italy in his grasp. His army, though smaller than Rome's vast reserves, had proven itself flexible, cunning, and resilient. Word of his triumphs spread quickly, unsettling Rome's allies and emboldening those who resented the Republic's dominance. Yet Hannibal knew that momentum alone was not enough. Rome's strength lay in its ability to recover from defeat, to raise new legions, and to keep pressing forward no matter the cost. To truly shake the Republic, Hannibal needed more than victories. He needed to unravel Rome's confidence, to show its allies that Rome could not protect them. The Alps had been conquered, the Trebia had been won, but the war was far from decided. It was in this state of tension that Hannibal turned his eyes toward central Italy and toward one of the most daring ambushes in history. The winter had been harsh, but the Carthaginian army endured. As the snow melted and spring began to stir the land, Hannibal moved his forces southward, leaving behind the icy rivers of the north. His path was deliberate, designed to draw the Romans after him. He raided villages, burned fields, and sent the smoke of destruction curling into the sky. It was not wanton cruelty, but strategy meant to provoke the Romans into reckless pursuit. He wanted them angry, impatient, certain that they could corner him. In this mood, they would make mistakes, and mistakes were Hannibal's sharpest weapons. The Roman Senate, still reeling from previous defeats, was determined to restore its honor. A new consul, Gaius Flaminius, took command of one of Rome's armies. Flaminius was bold, ambitious, and eager for glory, but he was also rash. He burned with desire to avenge the losses at the Trebia, to strike Hannibal down and show Rome that its legions could not be humiliated. Hannibal knew his man well. He studied Flaminius's character, understanding that pride and impatience would make him predictable. Where Scipio had been cautious, Flaminius would be reckless, and recklessness was something Hannibal could use. Hannibal's march south was carefully calculated. He devastated the countryside as he went, ensuring that word of his actions reached Flaminius. Villagers fled, spreading tales of burning farms and Carthaginian raiders. Flaminius, enraged by these reports, spurred his army forward without the careful reconnaissance that a more disciplined commander might have ordered. Hannibal, watching from afar, guided his army toward a place he had chosen with care, the northern shore of Lake Trasimene. Here, between the still waters of the lake and the rolling hills that bordered it, Hannibal would set his trap. The geography of Lake Trasimene was perfect for ambush. A narrow road wound along the lake's edge, pressed tightly between water and rising hills. Any army marching along it would be confined, unable to maneuver, unable to see what lay ahead or behind. Hannibal studied the terrain, envisioning the movements of the Romans, as though he were already watching them stumble into his net. He placed his infantry along the ridges, hidden by trees and brush. His cavalry and more mobile troops he stationed on the flanks, ready to close in. Every detail was considered. The timing, the concealment, the signals that would unleash the storm. To march into this valley was to march into the jaws of destruction, and Hannibal meant for Flaminius to do exactly that. The morning of the ambush was cloaked in mist. Heavy fog rolled down from the hills, veiling the land in a damp gray shroud. The Romans, rising in their camp, could barely see beyond a few paces. Hannibal, however, had planned for this. The fog would cover his troops, hiding their positions until the moment of attack. As the Roman columns began their march along the narrow road by the lake, they did so blind, their vision cut short by the mist. Their confidence unshaken by what they could not see. They believed Hannibal was fleeing ahead of them, and Flaminius, true to his nature, urged them onward in pursuit. The trap was sprung with sudden ferocity. As the Roman vanguard pressed forward, horns sounded from the hills, and Carthaginian war cries erupted from the fog. From the ridges, Hannibal's infantry charged down, crashing into the Roman columns before they could form ranks. Cavalry swept in from the flanks, cutting off retreat, while the lake itself hemmed them in from the other side. Panic spread like wildfire. The Romans, caught off guard, found themselves pressed on all sides, unable to maneuver, unable even to see the full scope of the disaster unfolding around them. What had seemed like a simple march became, in an instant, a nightmare. Flaminius tried to rally his men, shouting for order, calling them to form ranks. But the fog swallowed his voice, and the chaos drowned him out. Units became separated, men stumbled into one another, shields clashed not against the enemy, but against their own comrades. In the confusion, Flaminius himself was struck down, his life ending in the very trap his pride had led them into. With their commander dead and their formation shattered, the Roman army collapsed into disarray. It was no battle in the traditional sense, no clash of ordered lines, was slaughter. The fighting raged for hours, but it was one-sided. Hannibal's men, descending from the hills, pressed relentlessly into the trapped Romans. The cavalry ensured that no one could escape easily, while the lake swallowed those who tried to flee into its waters. By the time the fog lifted and the sun burned through the mist, the battlefield was strewn with Roman dead. Estimates of the slaughter vary, but tens of thousands were killed or captured. It was one of the greatest disasters Rome had ever suffered. A catastrophe made worse by the fact that it had been so carefully engineered by Hannibal's cunning. For the Carthaginians, the victory at Lake Trasimene was not merely a triumph of arms, but of strategy. Hannibal had demonstrated once again that he could turn terrain itself into a weapon, that he could use nature and psychology as effectively as swords and spears. His men, hardened by the Alps and emboldened by their victories, fought with renewed confidence. Round their fires, they marveled at the trap they had sprung, at the brilliance of their commander, at the sheer scale of the Roman defeat. They felt themselves not merely survivors, but instruments of destiny, chosen to bring Rome to its knees. Rome, however, did not collapse. The Republic grieved its dead, raged at its losses, but it did not surrender. Instead, the Senate turned to a new solution: the appointment of a dictator. A single man with supreme authority to steer the state through crisis. That man was Quintus Fabius Maximus, whose cautious strategies would earn him the name the Delayer. Fabius believed that Rome could not match Hannibal in open battle, that the only way to defeat him was through patience, attrition, and denial. Yet this was still to come. In the immediate aftermath of Trasimene, Rome was stunned, its legions shattered, its confidence shaken as never before. For Hannibal, the victory was another step in his grand design. He had crossed the Alps, defeated armies at the Trebia, and now destroyed one of Rome's consuls at Lake Trasimene. Each triumph chipped away at the myth of Roman invincibility. Each disaster pushed Rome's allies closer to abandoning the Republic. Yet Hannibal also knew that time was not entirely on his side. Every battle cost him men he could not easily replace. Rome, with its vast reserves, could always raise new legions. His task was to win not just battles, but allies, to convince the peoples of Italy that his cause was theirs. Lake Trasimene gave him the proof he needed. Rome could not protect its own armies, much less its allies. In the quiet after the battle, Hannibal walked the field, surveying the wreckage of Roman pride. The lake's waters lapped gently at the shore, as though mocking the violence that had unfolded beside them. The fog had lifted, revealing the hills where his men had hidden. The road where the Romans had marched blindly into their fate was a moment of solemnity as much as triumph. Hannibal knew that each victory brought him closer to his ultimate goal, but also deeper into enemy territory, where Rome's strength would grow ever more dangerous. Still, in that moment, he allowed himself to breathe the rare air of satisfaction. His gamble had worked once again. Rome had suffered defeat upon defeat. The Trebia, Hannibal had lured its legions into icy waters and shattered them. At Lake Trasimene, he had destroyed an entire army in the fog, killing one consul and humiliating the Republic on its own soil. The Senate, shaken but not broken, knew that desperate times demanded desperate measures. In its fear and anger, it turned to a solution older than the Republic itself: the appointment of a dictator. Unlike the consuls, who shared power and could be checked by one another, a dictator wielded supreme authority in moments of crisis. Into this role stepped Quintus Fabius Maximus, a man whose name would be remembered not for rash glory but for patience, endurance, and restraint. Fabius was unlike the commanders Rome had sent before. Where Flaminius had been hot-headed and reckless, Fabius was calm and methodical, but he did not hunger for dramatic victory. nor did he allow pride to push him into traps. His strategy was simple, yet radical. He would not fight Hannibal directly. He would shadow him, harass his foragers, cut off his supplies, and wait. He believed that Hannibal, so far from home, with no steady line of reinforcement, would eventually wither if denied the great decisive battle he sought. It was a strategy born of humility, an admission that Rome could not match Hannibal's genius on the battlefield. And for this humility, many in Rome despised him at first. Hannibal too recognized the shift immediately. He had come to Italy expecting confrontation, counting on Rome's pride to force it into battle again and again. But Fabius refused to give him that satisfaction. Wherever Hannibal marched, Fabius followed, keeping just out of reach, like a shadow on the hillside. Whenever Hannibal sent out raiding parties, Fabius's men struck at them, snatching what supplies they could. Whenever Hannibal tried to lure the Romans into an ambush, Fabius calmly declined. It was as though Hannibal, master of cunning and surprise, had met an opponent who could not be tricked, who chose patience over passion. The frustration this caused Hannibal's men was immense. They were soldiers of action, hardened by victories, eager for the clash of spears and the roar of battle. Instead, they found themselves pursued by an enemy who would not fight. The Romans seemed always present, their camps visible on distant ridges, their scouts dogging every move. Yet when battle was offered, they melted away. Hannibal tried every trick he knew to provoke them, feigned retreats, raids designed to inflame Roman pride, displays of boldness meant to insult their honor. But Fabius remained steady, refusing to be drawn. His silence on the battlefield was louder than any war cry, a reminder that Rome had found a new way to fight. The Italian countryside bore the cost of this strategy. Hannibal continued his raids, burning farms, seizing food, and attempting to persuade Rome's allies to defect. The smoke of villages rose into the sky, carrying fear and anger with it. Fabius, watching, refused to be goaded. He knew that to attack on Hannibal's terms would risk disaster. Better, he believed, to save Rome's strength, to endure the humiliation, and to wait until the invader weakened himself. His soldiers grumbled, the Senate questioned him, and the people of Rome mocked his caution. They called him timid, fearful, even cowardly. Yet Fabius remained unmoved, his eyes fixed on the long game, his mind set on saving the Republic by patience rather than glory. Hannibal, for his part, tried to break free from Fabius's shadow. He moved across the land, plundering and foraging, seeking fresh ground to exploit. But wherever he went, Fabius was never far behind. The two armies became like twin shadows cast across Italy, each watching the other, each waiting for a mistake. Hannibal began to feel the strain of distance. His men grew restless, his supplies grew thin, and his Italian allies remained cautious. Unwilling to commit fully until Rome showed weakness, he had struck mighty blows, yet the Republic still stood. The longer the war dragged on, the more uncertain his position became. One of the most famous encounters between the two commanders came when Hannibal marched into the region of Campania. The land there was fertile, its fields wide, its towns rich, and Hannibal hoped to draw the Romans into defending it. He burned and plundered, sending devastation across the countryside. But when it came time to withdraw, he found the mountain passes blocked. Fabius had finally cornered him, cutting off his escape route. For a moment, it seemed that the patient dictator might have trapped the great Hannibal. Yet Hannibal, master of improvisation, devised a plan as cunning as any he had ever conceived. At night, he gathered cattle from the surrounding countryside and tied burning torches to their horns. When darkness fell, the animals were driven up the slopes, their flames flickering wildly in the night. To the Romans, watching from their positions above, it seemed as though the Carthaginians were attempting a mass escape under cover of light. They rushed to block the phantom army, leaving the true passes unguarded. Hannibal's men slipped through the gap quietly, their escape complete by dawn. When Fabius realized the trick, it was too late. Hannibal had turned even cattle into weapons, outthinking his enemy once more. Yet even in this escape, Hannibal recognized the challenge he faced. Fabius had not been defeated, only deceived, and soon the Romans were shadowing him again. The strategy of attrition continued, wearing at the Carthaginian army, fraying its morale, testing its patience. Hannibal longed for another great battle, something to equal or surpass the triumph at Trasimene. but the opportunity never came. Instead, he found himself in a war of endurance, one that drained rather than glorified. It was not what he wanted, but it was the reality forced upon him by Fabius's calm persistence. In Rome, however, Fabius's unpopularity grew. Many senators despised his caution, yearning for the decisive victories of old. The Roman people, impatient with delay, mocked him as Cunctator the Delayer, a name meant as insult but one that history would later render as praise. To them, patience felt like weakness, and endurance felt like surrender. Rome was a city of action, of legions marching proudly to battle, not of hiding in the hills while its lands burned. Fabius's wisdom was not yet appreciated, and his hold on power began to weaken as others argued for a return to more aggressive strategy. For Hannibal, this shift in Roman politics was a glimmer of opportunity. He sensed that Rome's pride would not tolerate caution forever, that sooner or later it would send another army eager for battle. He bided his time, waiting for the moment when Rome's impatience would undo the restraint that had kept him in check. He encouraged this by continuing his raids, ensuring that the humiliation stung deeply enough to demand a response. If Fabius would not give him the fight he wanted, perhaps someone else eventually would. And when that day came, Hannibal intended to be ready. As the months passed, both armies settled into the strange rhythm of shadow war. There were no great battles, only skirmishes, ambushes, and raids. The land suffered, the people endured, and the war dragged on without clear resolution. Hannibal's legend remained strong, but his supplies remained uncertain. Fabius's reputation faltered, but his strategy quietly preserved Rome's strength. It was a contest not of swords but of wills, a slow tightening of the rope between two men who understood each other too well. One sought to strike and win, the other sought to wait and wear down. By the time Hannibal marched his army into the southeastern plains of Italy, the war had been raging for nearly 2 years. The victories at Trebia and Trasimene had proven his brilliance, while Fabius's shadow campaign had tested his patience. Yet Rome still stood unbroken, its senate still resolute, its people still stubbornly unwilling to yield. Hannibal knew that to end the war swiftly, he needed something more than raids and victories. He needed a blow so great that Rome itself would tremble, a defeat so crushing that its allies would abandon it in despair. It was this vision that carried him to the flat, open fields near the small town of Cannae, where destiny would soon unfold. Rome, too, had grown weary of waiting. Fabius's cautious strategy had preserved the Republic, but it had also allowed Hannibal to roam freely, devastating the countryside and humiliating the Senate. Many Romans saw patience as weakness, and their pride demanded vengeance. In 216 BCE, Rome raised the largest army it had ever assembled, a force of nearly 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. 2 consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, were given joint command, alternating leadership day by day. It was a massive display of Roman power, a statement that no invader could defy the Republic and live. Against Hannibal's smaller force, they believed sheer numbers would decide the matter. Hannibal saw it differently. To him, the vast size of the Roman army was not a strength, but a weakness, waiting to be exploited. He had fewer men, perhaps 50,000 at most, but his force was balanced, experienced, and disciplined under his command. His cavalry, especially the Numidians, remained superior in skill and maneuverability. And above all, he possessed the advantage of strategy. Where the Romans believed numbers alone could crush him, Hannibal saw an opportunity to use their mass against them, to turn their strength into a trap from which there would be no escape. The plains near Cannae were perfectly suited to his design. The ground was wide and open, ideal for cavalry maneuvers. And the hot summer winds swept dust across the fields, reducing visibility and making order difficult to maintain. Hannibal positioned his forces with care, placing his weaker infantry in the center, the stronger African veterans on the flanks, and his cavalry ready to strike. It was a formation designed not for immediate strength, but for deception. He meant for the Romans to believe they were pushing him back, even as they marched into the jaws of encirclement. The Romans, confident in their numbers, arranged their legions in deep columns rather than wide lines, intending to smash through Hannibal's center with overwhelming force. To them, it was simple. Drive forward, crush the enemy, and end the war. They saw Hannibal's placement of his weaker troops in the middle as a sign of desperation, not as part of a trap. Varro, who commanded on the day of the battle, pushed aggressively, eager to claim glory. Paulus, the more cautious consul, had warned against rashness, but with alternating authority, his voice carried no weight. The march of Rome's legions began, a tide of steel and shields moving across the field. The clash was brutal from the start. The Roman infantry slammed into Hannibal's center, driving the Iberians and Gauls back step by step. Dust rose in clouds, the sound of steel and cries filling the air. To the Romans, it seemed that their plan was working, that Hannibal's line was bending under their weight. Varro urged them forward, deeper and deeper into the Carthaginian formation. But this bending was no collapse. It was exactly what Hannibal intended. His center retreated in controlled rhythm, giving ground without breaking, luring the Romans further into the narrowing jaws of the trap. On the flanks, the African infantry held steady, waiting. These were Hannibal's veterans, disciplined and hardened by years of war. As the Romans pushed further into the sagging center, the Africans began to wheel inward, their lines curving around like closing gates. The Romans, packed tightly in their deep columns, could not see clearly through the dust. They only pressed forward, unaware that the battlefield itself was turning against them. By the time they realized, it was too late. The Carthaginian flanks had closed in, and the Roman army was being enveloped. Meanwhile, Hannibal's cavalry struck with devastating precision. On the Roman left, his heavy horse charged directly into their cavalry, overwhelming them with speed and strength. On the right, the Numidian light horse harassed and distracted, keeping the Roman allies pinned. Once the Roman cavalry had been scattered, Hannibal's riders wheeled back, striking the Roman infantry from behind. The trap was complete. Romans to the front, Africans to the flanks, cavalry to the rear. The greatest army Rome had ever assembled was encircled, compressed into a killing ground from which there was no escape. The slaughter was unimaginable. Trapped in the dust and chaos, the Romans could not maneuver, could not even raise their weapons properly. They were packed so tightly that many could not swing their swords, crushed by their own numbers. Carthaginian blades cut them down relentlessly, the circle tightening with every moment. Men cried out in desperation, some begging for quarter, others trying to flee into the river, only to be cut down as they ran. For hours the killing went on, until the Roman army ceased to exist as an organized force. Tens of thousands lay dead upon the field, their banners trampled, their pride annihilated. When the sun set over Cannae, the scale of the disaster became clear. Its estimates vary, but as many as 50,000 to 60,000 Romans had been killed in a single day, including senators, officers, and nobles. It was one of the greatest defeats Rome had ever suffered, perhaps the greatest military disaster in its long history. Hannibal's losses were minimal by comparison. The fields were littered with Roman corpses, a sea of broken shields and abandoned standards. Hannibal had not merely won a battle. He had achieved one of the most perfect tactical victories in the history of warfare. For his soldiers, the triumph at Cannae was almost beyond belief. They had faced the might of Rome at its fullest and destroyed it utterly. Round their fires that night, they spoke in hushed voices of what they had seen, of the sheer scale of the victory. The Numidians laughed at how easily they had outmaneuvered the Roman horse. The African veterans nodded silently, proud of their steady discipline. Even the elephants, though few remained, had taken part in the spectacle, their looming presence adding to the terror of the Romans. It was a day that confirmed for every man in Hannibal's army that they followed not just a commander, but a master of destiny. Rome, however, did not collapse as Hannibal had hoped. The city was shaken, mourning its dead, fearing invasion, but it did not surrender. The Senate met, resolved, and forbade talk of peace. Allies wavered, some defecting to Hannibal, yet the core of the Republic remained intact. Fabius's warnings suddenly seemed wise. Better to endure humiliation than risk annihilation. Hannibal had won a masterpiece at Cannae, but he had not broken Rome's will. Instead, he had forced the Republic to adapt, to dig in, and to prepare for a war of endurance unlike any it had faced before. For Hannibal, Cannae was both triumph and turning point. He had achieved the greatest battlefield victory of his career, yet his gamble to break Rome through shock and awe failed. His army could not march directly on the city, lacking the siege equipment and reinforcements needed. Instead, he turned to diplomacy, hoping that Rome's allies would abandon it in the face of such disaster. Some did. Capua, the second city of Italy, opened its gates to him. But many others remained loyal to Rome, bound by fear, by duty, or by the sheer stubbornness of the Republic. Cannae had proven Hannibal's genius, but it had also revealed Rome's resilience. The fields of Cannae were soaked in Roman blood, and Hannibal stood at the height of his power. He had destroyed the greatest army the Republic had ever assembled, shattered the pride of its legions, and proven himself the master of battlefield genius. Yet even in the glow of triumph, cracks began to show. He had not marched on Rome itself, and many wondered why. To his soldiers, the city seemed within reach, shaken and vulnerable. But Hannibal knew better. Rome was not merely walls and streets. Its inner set was a fortress of spirit, defended not only by legions, but by the resolve of its people. To storm it without siege equipment, without steady reinforcements, would be to throw away everything he had gained. Hannibal was bold, but he was not reckless. He chose patience, hoping that Rome's allies would abandon it after Cannae, leaving the Republic hollow and ready to collapse. Some did. Capua, the second city of Italy, defected to his side, offering its wealth and resources. Other towns and regions wavered, tempted by the chance to free themselves from Roman control. In southern Italy especially, Hannibal found willing partners, men who had long resented Rome's dominance. Yet for every ally gained, many more remained loyal. Rome's network of alliances, built over generations, proved stronger than even Hannibal had imagined. Fear, tradition, and the iron will of the Senate kept much of Italy bound to the Republic. Hannibal had dealt Rome a mortal wound, but the body still lived, and it would not give up easily. The years after Cannae became a long war of attrition. Hannibal ranged across Italy, striking where he could, seizing towns, destroying Roman forces sent against him. Yet each victory, though impressive, failed to bring the decisive collapse he sought. Rome, learning from its mistakes, avoided giving him the kind of battles he desired. Fabius's cautious shadow lingered in Roman strategy, and though the people despised delay, they came to understand that Hannibal could not be defeated in open combat. Instead, they bled him slowly, cutting off supplies, retaking towns, and raising new legions year after year. For Hannibal's soldiers, life in Italy was a strange mixture of triumph and frustration. They had survived the Alps, crushed Rome's armies, and marched unchallenged across fertile lands, yet they were far from home, cut off from Carthage, with no clear end in sight. Supplies had to be foraged, allies had to be convinced, and every day brought the threat of Roman counterattacks. Still, their loyalty to Hannibal remained strong. They trusted his leadership, respected his courage, and believed in his vision. Around their campfires, they spoke of home, of the battles they had fought, and of the hope that one more great victory might finally break Rome. The elephants, once so central to Hannibal's march, had by now nearly all perished. The cold of the Alps, the scarcity of food, and the long campaigns of Italy had taken their toll. A few remained for a time, symbols of Carthaginian power, but they were no longer the decisive force they had once been. Hannibal relied instead on his cavalry, his veterans, and above all, his mind. The loss of the elephants was symbolic. The miracle of the Alps had passed, and now the war became one of endurance, a slow grind rather than a blazing triumph. Rome, for its part, adapted in remarkable ways. The Republic raised new armies relentlessly, calling upon its vast reserves of manpower. Even after the disaster of Cannae, new legions were trained and sent into the field. Defeat did not break, Rome hardened it. The Senate made harsh decisions, executing deserters, demanding loyalty from allies, and punishing towns that wavered. The city's stubbornness became its greatest weapon. Where any other power might have sued for peace after such disasters, Rome refused even to consider it. To Hannibal's frustration, his victory seemed only to deepen Roman resolve. In the midst of this struggle, a new figure began to rise. Publius Cornelius Scipio, the same young man who had narrowly escaped death at the Ticinus years before. He had witnessed Hannibal's brilliance firsthand, and he carried with him a burning desire to understand and defeat the Carthaginian. Scipio's rise was gradual, built on courage in battle and sharpness of mind. He studied Hannibal's tactics, learning not only from Rome's defeats, but from Hannibal's methods. Where others feared the Carthaginian, Scipio respected him as a teacher, even as an enemy. Their destinies, already entwined, were moving steadily toward one another. Hannibal's greatest challenge during these years was not the legions, but time itself. With each passing season, his army grew thinner, his supplies harder to gather, his allies more hesitant. Carthage, far away across the sea, sent reinforcements only sparingly, distracted by its own politics and wars in Spain. Hannibal remained in Italy, isolated, a brilliant flame burning without fresh fuel. He still won victories, still humbled Roman commanders, but none were enough to break the Republic entirely. The war had become a stalemate, one that drained him slowly. While Rome gathered strength for the future, the people of Italy lived in the shadow of this long war. Farmers saw their fields burned by both sides, villages changed hands, and fear hung heavy in the air. Some towns welcomed Hannibal as a liberator, only to find themselves abandoned when Rome returned. Others resisted him fiercely, unwilling to betray their loyalty to the Republic. It was a war that blurred lines, where survival often mattered more than allegiance. Through it all, Hannibal maintained his vision, believing that persistence would eventually bear fruit, that Rome could not endure forever. Yet Rome, like the mountains he had crossed, proved immovable. In Capua, Hannibal enjoyed his greatest Italian ally. The city provided him with rest, resources, and prestige. For a time, it seemed as though Capua might serve as a new base, a rival to Rome within Italy. But Rome responded ruthlessly, besieging the city and eventually retaking it. The lesson was clear. Hannibal could win battles, but Rome would not allow its grip on Italy to be loosened. Every ally gained risked destruction, and every success seemed to provoke even harsher retaliation. Hannibal's victories glowed brightly, but they lit fires that Rome smothered with relentless determination. As the years dragged on, Hannibal's dream of breaking Rome began to fade. He remained undefeated in open battle, yet that very fact became meaningless as Rome refused to meet him in the way he wanted. The Republic fought him not with one decisive army, but with 1,000 small cuts, draining his strength, limiting his options, and denying him the satisfaction of another canny. Noble became a shadow in Italy, feared and respected, but no longer the unstoppable storm he had once seemed. His legend grew, but his power waned. For his soldiers, the strain was immense. It followed him across mountains, through rivers, and into countless battles. It endured hunger, hardship, and exile. Many longed for home, yet they remained bound by loyalty to their commander. Hannibal's presence still inspired them, his calm confidence a shield against despair. He walked among them as he had in the Alps, sharing their hardships, listening to their grievances, reminding them that their struggle was part of something greater. Yet even they could see that the war was changing, that Rome's grip on Italy was tightening rather than loosening. Years stretched on, and Hannibal remained in Italy like a storm cloud that would not disperse. He had marched across the Alps, shattered Roman legions at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae, and yet Rome refused to fall. His soldiers still followed him with loyalty, his enemies still feared him, but the momentum of the war was no longer his. Rome had grown wiser, more patient, and more disciplined. The Senate no longer rushed blindly into battle. Instead, they contained Hannibal, limited his reach, and slowly reclaimed their allies. Each year that passed drained Carthage's strength and hardened Rome's will. Hannibal, undefeated in open battle, found himself fighting a war that could not be won by tactics alone. Carthage itself was distant and distracted. The city's leaders, cautious and divided, had never fully supported Hannibal's daring gamble in Italy. Supplies and reinforcements trickled in, but never in the numbers needed. Meanwhile, Rome struck at Carthage's holdings abroad, particularly in Spain, where young commanders proved themselves against Carthaginian forces. Among them was Publius Cornelius Scipio, the same man who had once escaped Hannibal's cavalry at the Ticinus. Now grown, Scipio demonstrated brilliance of his own, reclaiming Spain for Rome and cutting away at Carthage's power. Where Hannibal had sought to bring Rome down by striking its heart, Scipio sought to break Carthage by dismantling its limbs. By the time Scipio returned to Rome, his reputation shone brightly. He had shown himself bold, clever, and adaptable qualities that reminded many of Hannibal himself. Rome, weary of years of struggle, found in Scipio the leader it needed. In 204 BCE, he proposed carrying the war to Africa, forcing Carthage to recall Hannibal from Italy. The Senate, cautious after so many disasters, hesitated at first. But Scipio's determination won them over, and with a carefully prepared army, he crossed the sea to Africa, striking directly at Carthage's homeland. For Hannibal, this moment changed everything. After more than 15 years in Italy, he was summoned home to defend the city that had once sent him forth with such hope. The recall was bittersweet. Hannibal had devoted his life to breaking Rome, leading his men across mountains, rivers, and plains. Fighting battle after battle in a foreign land, now he was leaving Italy behind, not in triumph, but in necessity. His army, though still loyal, was diminished, worn thin by years of campaigning. Many of the veterans who had marched with him over the Alps were gone, their bones lying beneath Italian soil. Yet Hannibal remained unbroken, his spirit still fierce, his mind still sharp. If Rome thought his recall meant weakness, they would learn otherwise. He would fight one last time, with all the brilliance he had shown before, and the outcome would decide not only his fate, but that of Carthage itself. In Africa, the stage was set for the final confrontation. Scipio had already proven himself in battles against Carthage's local forces, winning allies among Numidian princes and strengthening Rome's position. His army was disciplined, experienced, and inspired by his leadership. Hannibal, by contrast, faced the challenge of rebuilding his strength. Carthage furnished him with new troops, levies, mercenaries, and a handful of elephants, but these were not the seasoned veterans of Italy. Still, Hannibal's presence alone gave them confidence. He had become a legend in his own lifetime, the man who had marched across the Alps and humbled Rome again and again. If anyone could turn raw recruits into a force capable of victory, it was he. The two armies met in 202 BCE on the plains near the town of Zama. The land was flat and open, ideal for cavalry maneuvers. Hannibal arranged his forces carefully, elephants in the front to break the Roman lines, infantry in successive layers, and cavalry on the wings. Scipio, studying him, adjusted accordingly. He left lanes between his units, gaps through which the elephants might charge harmlessly, while placing his strongest troops in reserve. It was a battle not only of armies, but of minds, each commander anticipating the other's moves, each aware that the stakes were nothing less than the survival of their people. The clash began with the elephants. Driven forward with shouts and prods, the massive beasts charged at the Roman lines. But Scipio's preparation showed its worth. The lanes opened, and many of the elephants passed harmlessly through, panicked by trumpets and javelins, trampling into the distance rather than breaking the Roman ranks. Others turned back in confusion, crashing into Hannibal's own troops and sowing disorder. What had once been the most fearsome of weapons now faltered, their impact blunted by Roman discipline and clever design. Then came the infantry. Hannibal's front lines surged forward, Iberians and Gauls clashing with Rome's legionaries. The fighting was fierce, blades flashing, shields locking, cries echoing across the field. Hannibal's second line pressed in behind, adding weight to the struggle. For a time, the battle hung in balance, the dust rising in clouds, the outcome uncertain. Yet Scipio held his reserves steady, waiting for the moment when Hannibal would commit fully. When the Carthaginian veterans, Hannibal's last and strongest troops, entered the fight, Scipio unleashed his final maneuver. His cavalry, having driven Hannibal's horse from the field, turned to strike from behind, just as Hannibal's had done so many years earlier at Cannae. The trap closed, but this time it was Rome's doing. Hannibal's army, pressed from front and rear, began to collapse. His veterans fought with desperate courage, standing their ground even as the circle tightened, but the weight of numbers and exhaustion was too great. Slowly, inevitably, the Carthaginian line gave way. What Hannibal had once inflicted upon Rome at Cannae was now inflicted upon him at Zama. The irony was bitter and undeniable. The master of encirclement had been encircled himself. As the dust settled, the outcome was clear. Hannibal's army lay broken, tens of thousands dead or captured. Carthage had no strength left to resist. The city sued for peace, accepting harsh terms that stripped it of its empire. its navy, and its ability to wage war. Rome had triumphed, not by crushing Hannibal in Italy, but by outlasting him, by forcing him into a final battle on ground of its choosing. The Second Punic War was over, and with it ended the dream that Carthage might rival Rome for mastery of the Mediterranean. For Hannibal, the defeat was a wound deeper than any arrow or sword could inflict. He had given his life to the struggle, carried his men across mountains and through countless battles, outwitted generals, and humbled legions. Yet in the end, Rome endured. He returned to Carthage not as a conqueror, but as a survivor, honored by his people, but haunted by the shadow of failure. Still, he remained proud, knowing that he had dared what no other had dared, that he had carried war to Rome's very doorstep and defied the greatest power of his age for nearly 2 decades. In later years, Hannibal turned to politics, serving Carthage as best he could, reforming its government and finances. Yet Rome never forgot him, never forgave him. Even in exile, hunted from court to court across the Mediterranean, his name carried weight. To some, he was a hero, a symbol of resistance against overwhelming odds. To others, he was a reminder of terror, the man who had once stood so close to Rome's gates. Hannibal Barca lived out his final years far from the land he had once marched across, ending his life in exile rather than fall into Roman hands. Thus, the story of Hannibal's march over the Alps closes not in victory, but in a kind of tragic greatness. He had attempted the impossible and nearly achieved it. He had turned mountains into roads, rivers into pathways, battles into masterpieces. Yet in the end, he faced an enemy whose resilience matched his genius, whose stubbornness outlasted his daring. Rome survived and Carthage faded, but Hannibal's name endured. His march became legend, his battles became lessons studied for centuries, and his defiance became a symbol of human will against impossible odds. And so, as the last fires of Zama fade, the tale settles into silence. Hannibal's footsteps still echo in the mountains, his elephants still linger in memory, his voice still speaks in the strategies of generals who came long after. May have lost the war, but he won immortality. In the quiet of history's night, Hannibal Barca remains, a figure both victorious and defeated, remembered not for how his story ended, but for how boldly he dared to write it.